Getting revenge on the nurses who tortured my grandmother. My grandmother with Parkinson's lived in a nursing home, and every time I visited her, she had new bruises all over her body. The nurses kept saying she just fell down, that falls were expected with Parkinson's. But this one nurse, Vivian, always smirked when she said it. I knew something was up but couldn't prove it, until a maintenance worker named Sam pulled me aside and said he needed to tell me something before he quit. The nursing staff had a betting board in their break room, where they placed daily bets on which residents would fall and how many times. My grandmother was on that board with the nickname Shaky Sue, and nurses were putting money on whether she'd fall more or less than 3 times per shift. My hands started shaking with rage as Sam showed me a photo he'd taken of the board that morning. There was my grandmother's name and dollar amounts from different nurses. Vivian had $20 on 4+ falls Friday. Another nurse named Beverly bet that my grandmother would fall during bath time specifically. I wanted to kill them right there in that parking lot. My grandmother was the woman who raised me when my parents died, who taught me to read, who still tried to slip me $5 bills even though her hands shook too much to hold the money. I went straight to the director's office with Sam's photo, and she looked at it for 2 seconds before saying it was clearly a misunderstanding and probably just a poorly thought out motivation system for tracking patient incidents. She said Sam was a disgruntled employee who'd been fired for theft, which Sam had already told me was a lie they'd made up when he'd complained about the betting. I demanded to see my grandmother's incident reports, and there were 17 documented falls in the past month, every single one marked as unwitnessed and consistent with disease progression. I was shaking with fury as the director said they were following all protocols and documenting everything properly. I asked why my grandmother fell so much more here than she ever did at home, and she said institutional settings were different, and I shouldn't compare them. I went to my grandmother's room and found her sitting in her chair with a black eye she didn't have yesterday, and I felt something break inside me. When I asked what happened, she whispered that Vivian had moved her walker out of reach that morning, and she tried to get to the bathroom on her own. She said Vivian and Beverly often did that, putting things just far enough away that she'd have to risk standing without support. My grandmother said sometimes they'd call her to come quickly for medication, and then act surprised when she fell trying to hurry. She'd been too scared to tell me because Vivian said she'd make sure my grandmother got moved to the dementia ward, where visitors weren't allowed as often. I held my grandmother while she cried, and I wanted to burn the whole building down with those nurses inside it. The director said without proof of intentional negligence, she couldn't take action against her nursing staff based on the word of a confused elderly woman and a terminated maintenance worker. I called Adult Protective Services, but they said the facility was documenting falls appropriately and following standard protocols for Parkinson's patients. They said betting might be inappropriate but wasn't illegal if it didn't affect care, and there was no proof it did. I found out from another resident's daughter that her father had mysteriously stopped falling once he'd been moved away from Vivian's section. Another family told me their mother with MS had fallen constantly until they'd installed a hidden camera and threatened to sue. Then suddenly she never fell again. When I confronted Vivian directly, she smiled and said my grandmother was lucky to have such a caring granddaughter, but maybe I should consider memory care since I seemed stressed and confused about standard Parkinson's progression. Beverly was standing behind her laughing and actually said, "Your grandma's a tough old bird. She can handle a few tumbles." A few tumbles, like my grandmother was some kind of toy for their sick entertainment, and I had to physically stop myself from attacking her right there. That night, my grandmother begged me not to leave her there, holding my hand with her shaking fingers and crying that she was scared to go to sleep because sometimes they'd wake her up by pulling her blankets off so she'd fall trying to grab them back. She told me Vivian had won $50 the previous week when my grandmother had fallen 5 times in one day, and they'd celebrated right in front of her, counting their money while she lay on the floor. My grandmother, who spent her whole life caring for others, was being tortured for beer money, and I couldn't get anyone to stop it. I spent the next morning calling every family member who had someone in that facility, and 7 of them confirmed their loved ones had excessive falls that mysteriously stopped when they switched nurses or facilities. One man said he'd actually heard Beverly joking about earning beer money off the Wobblies. The betting board had been running for at least 2 years, and management had to know about it. I had testimony from multiple families, photo evidence, and a clear pattern of abuse disguised as medical inevitability. These nurses were going to learn what happened when you tortured someone's grandmother for sport. Full story on the channel below.